Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this amazing event. I'm very, very pleased to be opening tonight the 24th Annual Martin Luther King Social Justice Award and Lecture, which you will hear about more in just a little bit. My name is Sarah Benet-Weiser. I am the Dean of the Annenberg School for Communication, and we have had a long and collaborative partnership with the Center for Africana Studies and this lecture series in particular. We have now been a partner with this lecture series for 23 years and counting. I'm super proud of this partnership and of this award and lecture. I think it is more important than ever for universities to cherish the interdisciplinary nature of higher education, and in particular to celebrate the intersections between and within Africana studies, communication, sociology, social justice, and anti-racist practice. At the Annenberg School, we commit to this kind of interdisciplinarity and social justice through an ethic of care and compassion. And actually, as the dean of the school, I reread Martin Luther King's Strength to Love quite often because it is such an important model, I think, for leadership, for the use of love as a powerful social and political force for change. And at this moment in U.S. history, I could not be more proud and more excited to welcome you all tonight to honor the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I now want to introduce the interim president of the University of Pennsylvania, Larry Jamison. He served as executive vice president of the University of Pennsylvania for the health system, and he was the dean of the Raymond and Ruth Perelman School of Medicine from 2011 to 2023. President Jamison has been a champion for equity of all kinds here at Penn. He listens with a compassionate ear. He creates spaces and resources for students, staff, and faculty. And importantly, when he was at Penn Medicine, he created the comprehensive anti-racism initiative, the Action for Cultural Transformation, implementing initiatives through 6 different work groups that focused on clinical, research, education, community, culture, and people, respectively. These initiatives include launching resource groups, requiring people to take bias training, administering the diversity engagement survey to measure the inclusivity of the culture. He is clearly committed to this cause. He's also a dedicated university citizen who brings deep appreciation for Penn's values and longstanding commitment to excellence through collaboration. I'm personally very grateful to President Jamison for his support for the work that we have been doing at the Annenberg School, and I please welcome President Larry Jamison.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's great to see all of you. And Dr. Benet-Weiser, thank you so much for your leadership and for that kind introduction. So I think you wouldn't be here if you weren't aware of the fact that each year, Penn and our local communities come together to commemorate Dr. King with service, scholarship, and the arts. And this lecture is one of several that we're going to have this week, but indeed it's the high point of many of the events that we're going to hold. So I have a brief story to tell. There was a time when Dr. King was at the Crozer Seminary just outside of Philadelphia. And remarkably, he took philosophy classes here at Penn. And I went through the records that are in our archives. He was able to audit these classes, and they were primarily in philosophy. He and his classmates studied Immanuel Kant, Karl Marx, and Mahatma Gandhi, and these ideas filled his notes at the time. Of significance, about a decade later, he published a book called Stride Toward Freedom about a period of time in Montgomery, Alabama. And there's a chapter in that book called Pilgrimage to Nonviolence, where it's fairly clear that some of the ideas that he may have acquired in these lectures about Gandhi helped inform his embrace of nonviolent resistance, and in his words, a courageous confrontation of evil by the power of love. So it's moving and humbling to imagine that a learning experience on this campus might have influenced some of Dr. King's most significant ideas and actions. And for those faculty in the audience, you never know who might be in the classes that you're teaching and how you might influence them and the great things that they will do. In that same spirit, we're here today to learn about another significant group of ideas. And on behalf of Penn, I'm really pleased to welcome our guest and honoree, Professor Orlando Patterson. His wide-ranging scholarship offers fresh insights into the dynamics of freedom, slavery, and justice, and his scholarship aligns perfectly with the purpose of this lecture. So, Professor Patterson will be on the stage soon. Thank you for being here. Thanks are also in order for all of those who organize this and the other MLK commemorative events that we hold on campus. Thank you for exemplifying Penn's commitment to community and fulfilling our missions at the highest levels of excellence. As we say in principle and practice, we are anchored in Philadelphia, and we're engaged with our community here locally, but also broadly across the world. So I'm now very pleased to introduce Wale Adebamwe, the Presidential Penn Compact Professor of Africana Studies and Director of Penn Center for Africana Studies. Wale?
Welcome. Can I please request that you silence your phones? Thank you. The Center for Africana Studies warmly welcomes you to the annual Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Award and Lecture in Social Justice. Tonight, we are delighted to present the 2025 Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Award to a distinguished scholar, thinker, and teacher who will also deliver the 2025 Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Lecture. The title of the lecture is Slavery and Genocide, the U.S., Jamaica, and the Historical Sociology of Evil. There will be much discussion about the United States turning 250 this year and next year. As we reflect on the accomplishment of this great nation, it is also important for us to continue to wrestle with the impact of slavery and evil in the modern world. Indeed, Dr. King's legacy, if we are to take seriously his life's work, requires us never to forget and to work towards creating a more perfect union and a humane world. We extend our sincere gratitude to Penn's interim president, Dr. J. Larry Jameson, and the Dean of Annenberg School for Communication, Dr. Sarah Bennett-Weiser, for their generous support. Inaugurated in 2002, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Lecture and Award in Social Justice is part of the university's annual celebration of Dr. King's life and legacy. The lecture brings to campus national and international scholars and public figures who have committed themselves to social justice. Notable past recipients of the King Award include Jesse Jackson, Angela Davis, Afro-Colombia civil rights leader Carlos Rosero, Cornel West, Nicole Anna Jones, Danny Glover, Trans Africa founder Randall Robinson, the late Julian Bond, Charles Blow, Joy Reid, and many others. The most recent was our own Dorothy Roberts. Our moderator and discussant for this evening's lecture is Professor Michael Hanchard. Dr. Hanchard, who was elected into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2021, is the Gustav C. Kumele Professor in Africana Studies in our department, where he directs the Marginalized Populations Project. His research and teaching interests combine a specialization in comparative politics with an interest in contemporary political theory encompassing themes of nationalism, racism, xenophobia, and citizenship. Dr. Hanchard has numerous widely cited and field-defining publications, including Orpheus, and PAR, the Movimento Negro of Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, Brazil, 1945 to 1988, Racial Politics in Contemporary Brazil, Party Politics, Horizons in Black Political Thought, and The Spectre of Race, How Discrimination Haunts Western Democracy. The Spectre of Race received the Ralph J. Bunche Award from the American Political Science Association in 2019 for the best book on ethnic and cultural pluralism, and was named one of the 10 best books of 2018 by the Times Educational Supplement of London. Professor Hanchard will be in conversation with Professor Orlando Patterson following his lecture. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our honoree tonight, Professor Orlando Patterson. Professor Patterson's contributions to the fields of historical and cultural sociology are profound and far-reaching. His scholarship has shaped our understanding of slavery, freedom, and social structures that define human experience. Yet, beyond his remarkable academic achievements, Professor Patterson is known for his generosity, integrity, and unwavering commitment to justice. It's a true honor to welcome him this evening. Orlando Patterson is the John Cowley Professor of Sociology at Harvard University. His scholarship has focused extensively on the culture and practice of freedom, the comparative study of slavery and ethno-racial relations, and the sociology of underdevelopment, with special reference to the Caribbean. His research also explores the problems of gender and familial relations in Black societies across the Americas and how cultural processes relate to poverty and other social outcomes. Professor Patterson is the author of numerous significant books, including Slavery and Social Debt, Freedom in the Making of Western Culture, The Confounding Island, Jamaica and Post-Colonial Predicament, and Enslavement, Past and Present, set to be released next week. Professor Patterson's groundbreaking scholarship has reshaped how we understand slavery's enduring impact on social structures and racial formations in the modern world. We are pleased to be able to honor him for his lifelong commitment to freedom and justice. In his introduction to the 2023 book, The Paradox of Freedom, a biographical dialogue, the result of a series of reflections between Patterson and David Scott, Scott raises some important questions which he believes animate the work of Patterson, and also, and I quote him here, haunts the archive of Western culture where freedom is believed to be a sacred value, unquote. So some of these questions that Scott raised include, what is the relationship between domination and freedom? More specifically, what is the relationship between enslavement, arguably the most extreme form of domination, and freedom, unquote. On the basis of these and other critical questions about domination and freedom, Scott concludes that, and I quote him again, part of what Patterson came to understand, perhaps only dimly and incompletely at first, but gradually and with sharpening illumination and a broadening archive, is that coming as it does from a certain form of life, an historical society that has been shaped fundamentally and maybe even persistently, chronically, by the powers of colonial plantation slavery, namely Jamaica, it could discern, almost as a form of implicit, embodied knowing, the ways in which these momentous universal questions about freedom's origins and standing has a humble and poignant and also immutable particularity, unquote. I have no doubt that Professor Patterson's unique understanding of the particularity of domination and freedom in relation to the global experience of both, historically and in the present, will be reflected in the lecture today on slavery and genocide. So please join me in welcoming to the stage our 2025 Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Social Justice Awardee, Professor Orlando Patterson.
So, thank you very much, Professor, for that gracious and very generous introduction. President Jameson, Dean Barney Wisner, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by saying how delighted and extremely honored I am to have been granted this prize, named in memory of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, America's great leader and icon of freedom. The study of slavery and its dialectical sublation, freedom, has been a lifelong preoccupation of mine and the focus of my scholarship. No one more embodies this fundamental dialectic of Western civilization, and especially of the American polity and culture, than Dr. King. The descendant of slaves, and in many ways the foremost fighter for and celebrant of freedom in his nation. In fighting for the freedom of Black people and oppressed peoples generally, Dr. King fought for and defined in real terms the true meaning and purpose of freedom. Dr. King was also fully alert to the close and tragic link between slavery, its handmaiden racism, and genocide, as well as the related problem of ethnocide or cultural genocide, the interrelations of which will be the subject of my talk this evening. In his speech at Grosse Pointe High School in 1968, King observed that, quote, "the ultimate logic of racism is genocide." And in his seminal work, Why We Can't Wait, Dr. King wrote forcefully of America's original tragedy, the fact that the nation was initiated by the genocide of Native Americans. He wrote, "Our nation was born in genocide when it embraced the doctrine that the original Americans, the Indian, was an inferior race. Even before there were large numbers of Negroes on our shores, the scar of racial hatred had already disfigured colonial society. We are perhaps the only nation which tried, as a matter of national policy, to wipe out its indigenous population. Moreover, we elevated that tragic experience into a noble crusade. Our literature, our films, our drama, and our folklore all exalt it," unquote. Now, a central doctrine of that noble crusade, to which Dr. King refers, was, of course, the racist ideology of manifest destiny. You can surmise my utter astonishment when only yesterday I heard our newly installed leader promising that we will pursue our manifest destiny into the stars. Let us hope that it will be revived only to reach the stars this time, because its original consequence was genocide. Ladies and gentlemen, slavery and genocide are without question mankind's most heinous and ancient crimes. Understandably, there's now intense and growing scholarly inquiry on both subjects. A surprising feature of the contemporary study and popular debates on these two subjects, however, is the fact that, with a few notable exceptions, which I'll get to later, they have largely remained silent from each other. My talk tonight attempts to bring the two together. The talk has two parts. The first part examines the nature of slavery, genocide, and the closely related problem of ethnocide, sometimes called cultural genocide. The second part examines comparatively two cases of slavery in the Americas, the U.S. South and Jamaica. I argue that the U.S. South is the paradigmatic case of slavery resulting in outright ethnocide, as all slaveries do, while Jamaica is the paradigmatic case of a slave society that crossed over into a special kind of genocide, what I'm going to call protracted genocide. Let me begin with the definition of slavery. The traditional and still conventional approach is to define slavery in legal economic terms, typically as, quote, the status or condition of a person over whom any or all of the powers attaching to the right of ownership are exercised, unquote. That's a quote from the League of Nations, which is still widely used. In this view, the enslaved is quintessentially a chattel. The definition is problematic because while it adequately describes mainly Western and modern capitalistic slave systems, it does not cover most slaveries in the world. The conception of the enslaved as chattel originated in the practices and legal thought of ancient Rome, where it was quite appropriate, as it was in the modern capitalistic slave systems. However, in many non-Western parts of the world, several categories of persons who were clearly not enslaved, such as unmarried women, concubines, dead bondsmen, indentured servants, sometimes serfs as late as the 18th century, and occasionally children, were regularly bought and sold. In China, in Russia, even in East Germany in the early 19th century. Conversely, in many slaveholding societies, certain categories of the enslaved, such as those born in the household or women who had given birth to sons, as in many Islamic societies, by their enslavers, were not treated as chattels to be bought and sold, even though they remained very much slave. So the definition, the legal economic definition, is inadequate if your interest is slavery globally. Slavery, I've argued, is a relation of domination that is distinctive in three respects. First, the power of the enslaver was total, if not in law, almost always in practice. Violence was the basis of this power, even where laws forbade the killing of slaves. It was rarely the case that such murders were prosecuted, and that's true of the US as it was in Rome and other parts of the world. The totality of the enslaver's claims and powers in them meant that the enslaved could have no claims or powers in other persons or things, except with the slaveholder's permission. A major consequence of this was that the enslaved had no custodial claims on their children. They were genealogical isolates, lacking all recognized rights of ancestry and descent. As the self-liberated, formerly enslaved John Swanson Jacobs, brother of the more famous Harriet Jacobs, whose works were just found a year ago, noted, he, the slave, owns nothing. He can claim nothing. His wife is not his children are not his, unquote. From this flow the hereditary nature of the condition. Second, the enslaved were universally considered as outsiders, and that is central to my own definition. This being the major difference between them and serfs, servants, and other exploited peoples. They were natively alienated persons, I've described them, deracinated in the act of their or their ancestors' enslavement, who were held not to belong to the societies in which they lived, even if they and their ancestors were born there. They lacked all legal or recognized status as independent members of a community. In kin-based societies, they're referred to, and tribal societies, as kinless. They lacked all claims and rights of citizenship. Because they belonged only to their enslaver, they could not belong to the community. Because they were bonded only to their enslaver's household, they could share no recognized bond of loyalty and love with the community at large. To be sure, this does not mean that they had no informal, personal, and communal relations among themselves. They most certainly did. But all human beings need formal recognition of their deeply held relations, especially with kin, and assurances that they could not be arbitrarily terminated by others because they belonged to and were included in relations beyond their superiors. And this the enslaved did not have anywhere in the world. Third, the enslaved were everywhere considered to be dishonored persons. They had no honor that a non-slave person need respect. What Du Bois wrote of the Black American slave was true of the experiences of all enslaved people. Quote, they represented in a real sense the ultimate degradation of man. The tragedy of the black slave's position was precisely this, his absolute subjection to the individual will of another, unquote. Slaveholders could violate all aspects of their slaves' lives with impunity, including by raping them. A slave's wife or daughter, wrote the ex-slave Jacobs, may be insulted before his eyes with impunity. He himself may be called on to torture them and dare not refuse. The honorlessness of the enslaved served other ends than their debasement. It was a form of human parasitism in that it enhanced the ego and honor of the slaveholder. So for all these reasons, all over the world, there's a general tendency for enslavers and non-enslaved to conceive of and to treat the enslaved as socially dead persons. The enslaved themselves were acutely conscious of this conception and the socio-legal definition of their condition by the free. And while in their own eyes and in relations with fellow slaves, they did not consider themselves socially dead, it was a permanent dehumanizing affliction imposed on them that they often refer to when describing their condition and relating why real death was often preferable to the unfreedom and degradation of social death. And one finds this all over the world. Harriet Jacobs wrote that, quote, I'd rather live and die in jail than drag on from day to day through such a living death, unquote. Her contemporary, Frederick Douglass, repeatedly returned to the description of his enslavement as a kind of death. So I'm not making up the concept of social death. This emerged empirically from my comparative work. Describing his sense of freedom as, quote, glorious resurrection from the tomb of slavery. It's one of the most powerful metaphors I've ever read by a slave, an articulate one to be sure, of slavery. Throughout the Americas, the enslaved celebrated rather than mourned the death of kinsmen. and friends, since physical death brought a merciful end to the living social death of slavery and often a return to Africa. And one of the most frequent sketches of slaves in Jamaica and other parts of the world were the celebrations of the slave gatherings at the death of one of their members. Although the enslaved everywhere sought ways of relieving, escaping, and even violently resisting this imposed condition and of exercising agency, the consequences of social death could be devastating. It threatened the core social motives that psychologists have identified as essential for the effective social functioning and well-being. These are belonging, the need to freely affiliate and bond with others in strong and stable relationships and groups with shared common goals and interests that are not arbitrarily severed or disrupted. Second, understanding, the need to make sense of one's social environment and predict what is going to happen in case of uncertainties. Third, some measure of control in one's life. The feeling, I quote, of being effective in dealing with one's environment and in setting and realizing normal, everyday goals. Fourth, self-enhancement, maintaining some level of self-esteem. And finally, from the psychological literature, summarized beautifully by Fisk, trust. Seeing the world as a benevolent place with confidence in the reliability of others. Now, these fundamental motives, as Susan Fisk has pointed out, constitutes the essence of our humanity, with belonging being central to all of this. What Du Bois wrote of the American slave held true of the enslaved at all times and places. The hurt was not only his treatment in slavery, it was the wound dealt to his reputation as a human being. Nothing was left, nothing was sacred. Few formerly enslaved wrote more searingly than Jacobs, whom I've cited before, the brother of Harriet Jacob, of the tragic struggle they experience each day, reconciling their inherent humanity with the endless onslaught on it, on these 5 fundamental elements of what it is to be human, by the slaveholder and his societies, socially erasing definition of them as socially dead, or more acutely, to use Jacob's terms, murdered. Human nature, Jacob's, this ex-slave, a very articulate ex-slave wrote, will be human nature. Crush it as you may, it changes not. But slavery is unnatural, and it requires unnatural means to support it. Everything droops and feels its sting. Hope grows dimmer and dimmer until life becomes bitter and burdensome. At last, death frees the slave from his chains, but his wrongs are forgotten. He was oppressed, robbed, and murdered, socially murdered. Let me move now to genocide. Genocide is now used both in a strictly legal and a broader sociological sense. As noted earlier, the term was coined by, well, maybe I didn't in this talk, Raphael Lemkin, a Polish-born Jewish lawyer in response to the Holocaust, or Shoah. He defined it as, quote, the destruction of a nation or an ethnic group. The United Nations codified it more precisely in a legally binding document in the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which, as of April 2022, has been ratified by 153 states. According to this definition, genocide involves any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such, and that as such is an important term in this definition, at least legally. Killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or part. D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within a group, to which I'd like to draw special attention. And forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Now, almost every one of these elements of the definition has been contested by academics and genocide scholars. I don't have the time to go through all the debates, but I'm going to focus on one. Perhaps the key issue is intent. Intent. To what extent is it necessary for mass killings to be considered genocide? The issue of intending to kill. The convention holds that, quote, there must be a proven intent on the part of perpetrators to physically destroy the kinds of groups specified, which is what gives the crime of genocide its uniqueness, unquote. Okay? Now, the genocide scholar Alex Hinton has pointed out that the emphasis on intent and the exclusion of the mass killings of political groups from the definition of genocide was a result of political pressure from America, the Soviet Union, and other advanced nations with colonial history of oppressive treatment of minorities. The Soviet Union, for example, insisted on excluding the decimation of its own citizens as a result of failed political action and policies in light of the millions of Russian peasants and Ukrainian farmers who died due to the failed collectivization policies of Stalin. America, likewise, feared being charged with genocide for its history of slavery and Jim Crow. The lynching of blacks, please remember, was still common in 1948 when the convention was drawn up. In fact, hundreds of blacks were to be lynched after that. Indeed, several prominent black American leaders did formally urge the UN to charge America with genocide as a result of the historic destruction of the heritage of black Americans and the persisting racism and lynching of black people. This had been the argument made by two prominent black American civil rights leaders, William Patterson, no relation, and Paul Robeson, in the book-length petition written by Patterson, We Charge Genocide, on behalf of the Civil Rights Congress, a radical black group which was presented formally to the United Nations in 1951. And here's a picture of Robeson presenting the petition. And again, they were very persistent in 1970 by an emergency conference committee chaired by the famous black activist and actor Ossie Davis. It was summarily dismissed on both occasions. Among the arguments, by the way, they could have used but didn't know of that the data existed at that time and would have strengthened their argument, is the fact that the Nazi regime in developing its genocidal racial theory, drew directly on American Jim Crow laws in formulating its racist laws relating to the destruction of Jews. That has, by the way, been thoroughly documented in a recent book published by Yale University Press, that the Nazi regime used American Jim Crow laws in formulating its laws of genocide. Now, I want to move to cultural genocide. Many who work on genocide studies are concerned with the destruction of a people's culture. I mean, this, by the way, was already indicated in the work of Raphael Lemkin, the person, as I said, who invented the term genocide, who considered the destruction, such destruction, a form of genocide. Although after some consideration, the 1948 UN Convention decided not to include the term. Cultural destruction was pivotal in the work of an important philosopher of genocide, the late feminist philosopher Claudia Card of Wisconsin, who used my construct of social death as a central component of her definition of genocide, in which she made social death central. It is social death, she argues, and I quote, that enables us to distinguish the peculiar evil of genocide from the evils of other mass murders. Social vitality, she writes, exists through relationships, contemporary and intergenerational, that create an identity that gives meaning to a life. Major loss of social vitality is a loss of identity, and consequently a serious loss of meaning for one's existence. Putting social death, she writes, at the center takes the focus off individual choices, individual goals, individual careers, and body counts, and puts it on relationships that create community and set the context that gives meaning to choice and goals, unquote. Now, while I agree with Card that ethnic, cultural decimation is a critical factor in the crime of genocide, and I'm obviously quite happy that she used my work in such a central way, as a major element distinguishing it from other kinds of mass killings, such as the mass killings in warfare. One can still meaningfully distinguish between cultural extermination, or ethnocide, as it's sometimes called, and genocide. All genocides include some form of ethnocide and social death. But not all ethnocides entail physical extermination or mass killings. The idea that genocide involves mass killings is too entrenched to be discarded. Cultural genocide, or ethnocide, has been made unlawful in several international treaties and is now considered a crime against humanity. And at the group of, clearly, examples such as transferring children of the group to another group is considered an element of genocide in one convention. More recently, UNESCO, in collaboration with representatives of the Indian Peoples of America, issued a Declaration of San Jose, which held that ethnocide occurs when, quote, an ethnic group is denied the right to enjoy, develop, and transmit its own culture and its own language, whether collectively or individually, and declare that ethnocide, that is cultural genocide, is a violation of international law equivalent to genocide, unquote, even if not identical with it. The question whether cultural destruction amounts to genocide, even in the absence of mass killings, or should be distinguished from physical genocide, has become an important public issue prompted by revelations concerning the treatment of Native American children in Canada and the United States, which is still coming to light. This is a classic case of ethnocide, although whether it should also be considered genocide is still open to question. And by the way, this excludes the early killings of Native Americans, which is clear, outright genocide, as Dr. King pointed out, and as recent studies, most notably in the Cambridge History of Genocide, has made clear. Pope Francis, for one, has placed the Catholic Church seal of genocide on these atrocities in his recent public apology for these acts, which he called genocide without qualification. Now, comparing slavery with genocide, until recently, there have been surprisingly few works that have compared slavery, especially slavery in the Americas, with genocide, especially the Jewish Holocaust. An early exception was Stanley Elkins, who claimed to have found striking parallels between the, quote, somber personality of the African-American slave in response to the, quote, total institution of the plantation, depicted mainly in the stereotypes of their white slaveholders, and the psychological reaction of some Jewish inmates to the similar, quote, total institution of the concentration camp and their relations with their German concentration camp officers. And he drew on many of the autobiographies written by, especially psychologists, many of them Freudians, who had survived the camp. Both, he claimed, were infantilized by their oppression and became docile and psychologically dependent on their slaveholder and Nazi oppressors, respectively. The furor in response to this work was intense. I lived through it. I mean, this is long ago. It's before many of you were born. Most genocide scholars avoided the comparison between slavery and the concentration camp after that. Or like Jeffrey Herf, who's written widely on genocide, and Seymour Drescher, another historian who's written widely on genocide, emphasized the differences. However, more recently, several notable genocide scholars have compared the two forms of oppression. Many of them, I'd say most of them, in fact, drawing on my work, Slavery and Social Death, to make the distinction between genocide and slavery. The now classic work on the Jews in Nazi Germany by Marian Kaplan, for example, argued throughout the work that in the, quote, in the 1930s, Nazi Germany succeeded in forcing social death, ethnocide if you like, on its Jews, excommunicating them, subjecting them to inferior status, and relegating them to a perpetual state of dishonor, unquote. It's a classic case of social death. While genocide, she argues, in the strict sense of mass killings began with the death camps in 1940. Daniel Goldhagen's controversial work, Hitler's Willing Executioners, also used slavery and social death, and arguing in a similar vein, as did the work of the philosopher of evil, Lawrence Thomas, who focused on my concept of natal alienation at the heart of the concept of social death. The main argument of these works is that while comparable in their approach to evil, there was a fundamental difference between New World slavery, as well as slavery in general, and the Jewish Holocaust, as well as all genocides. That is, the slaveholder wanted to maintain the life of the enslaved in order to use their bodies, whereas the whole point of the Holocaust, after 1940 certainly, or earlier genocides, such as that of the Armenians, was the targeted killing and elimination of the Jewish people. But what if, in the course of exploiting people economically, the enslaved were worked to death? This is central to the argument I'll make in the final part of this talk, in a comparison of the US and Jamaica. And I want to turn to that now in this final section. My problem with works discussing slavery and comparing slavery and genocide is that they take too monolithic a view of slavery. There was significant variation among the New World slave systems, which complicates comparing slavery with genocide. There were differences due to the imperial framework under which they operated, differences due to the cultural origins of the slaveholder classes, differences due to economics, from those with small-scale family farm systems as the norm, such as that existed in this part of America in the North up to the end of the 18th century. The differences, as opposed to the plantation system, differences in patterns of residence of the slaveholder class, from those where the slaveholder class resided primarily in the slave region of their exploitation, as opposed to the absenteeism of the most important slaveholders in the Caribbean, who, once they made their riches, fled back to England, unable to live in the horrors they had created in the Caribbean. Now, in exploring the problem of genocide, ethnocide, and slavery, I have found that the US South and Jamaica constituted two paradigmatic cases, okay, which I want to talk to you about tonight. For blacks in the US slave system, the experience was one of classic ethnocide or cultural genocide. Deracination from their African cultural background and reduction to a state of social death in which they did not belong to the society in which they found themselves, even though by the early 18th century, the great majority were born in the US. This, like all slaveries, was a crime against humanity. There's no doubt about that, as is now clearly mandated in the Rome Statute of 1998 on genocide and related crimes. Their experience, however, was not that of genocide, as their demographic history makes clear. Dr. Martin Luther King would seem to agree with this, by the way. In his 1967 speech, Where Do We Go From Here?, he explicitly described the Black American past as one of cultural homicide, unquote, cultural homicide. It's very close to the notion of cultural genocide. But not genocide. And it's significant that when he referred, and he did so movingly, to the genocide of Native Americans, he did not extend that discussion to Black Americans. Instead, he used in his speech the term cultural homicide, or what I'm calling ethnocide. But I'm assuming he agrees with me. For Jamaican blacks, on the other hand, I'll show that the system was one not only of ethnocide, but of protracted genocide, with a cumulative physical destruction that amounted to nearly 6 million persons. And that's what I'm going to show you tonight. And although both Jamaica and the US South were plantation systems, the scale of slave ownership differed. The average ownership was only about 10 slaves in the United States, while on a typical large Jamaican plantation, the average ownership was more than 100 slaves. In the US South, the majority of people were free and white. In Jamaica, from the early 18th century, the vast majority were black and enslaved. The enslaved population outnumbering whites and the relatively few free by more than 10 to 1, and in certain periods, 12 to 1. For the whites who survived the tropical diseases, Jamaica became a source of great wealth, far beyond that of the US whites. In fact, it's been estimated that the typical Jamaican white was some 30 times wealthier than the typical American in the 18th century. Now, one fundamental difference between the two systems was the survival rate of the black population. In America, the planter class from early on calculated that it made economic sense to encourage the reproduction of their slave population, a decision encouraged by the cheaper cost of food in the United States, where there's a large free farming population and abundant land. This was in sharp contrast with Jamaica, where the sugar crop and slave trade led to the slaveholding class, to the economic calculation in which reproduction was seen as too costly, a burden, and was replaced by a strategy in which young Africans were bought and worked mercilessly with little concern for their welfare or survival. I use the term protracted or slow-moving genocide to explain the demographic and social situation of the black population in Jamaica during the period of British slavery from 1655 to 1838. Somewhat similar to the protracted destruction, by the way, and there's a lot in the history of genocide which is not known, which is only coming out now with recent studies. One of the greatest genocides took place in the 15th century. In many ways, even more destructive than the Jewish genocide, believe it or not. And that's of the Canary Islanders between 1402 and 1496, in which the entire population was decimated, its culture, its language, its religion totally destroyed by the Spanish over the course of that century. Now, the late distinguished University of Pennsylvania historian Richard Dunn has given us an indelible meso-level demographic analysis. Some of you may have even been colleagues or taken his courses. He's a great historian. Of these, what he called two radically different systems of action, wherein the Jamaican planters, I quoted him, treated the enslaved, quote, as disposable cogs in a machine, importing slaves from Africa, working them too hard, feeding them too little, exposing them to debilitating diseases, and routinely importing new Africans to replace those who died, unquote. In contrast to the demographic growth of the enslaved in Virginia. To be sure, the American slaveholders were no angels. For, as Michael Todman, another historian, has shown, the reproductive choice was made easier for the Americans in Virginia and later on in the Cotton Belt by virtue of the fact that the crops on which they made their wealth was not sugar, but tobacco and later cotton. That indeed, were sugar planters, where they were sugar planters, as they were in Louisiana, they were just as inhumanly destructive and genocidal, by the way, as their Jamaican counterpart, with similar lethal demographic consequences. Louisiana looks much more like Jamaica than it does the rest of the Cotton Belt, and sugar was the critical factor, okay? The demographic strategy of the Jamaican slaveholder was one of clear choice. As demographic historian Kenneth Kippel notes, quote, as long as a master had control over a slave's life, he controlled to a large extent what he consumed, and obviously his physical survival. Jamaican slaves spent their lives hungry and malnourished, on the verge of starvation, with numerous nutritional diseases resulting in endemic bone and dental problems, debilitating mood swings, pellagra, beriberi due to widespread thiamine deficiency, dropsy, dirt eating, which was a desperate response to calcium and other mineral deficiencies, as well as pure hunger. All of this weighed heavily, especially hard on children, whom the planters did not care about, whom malnutrition tormented twice, working much of its debilitating and often deadly effects through poor maternal nutrition before even touching the child via his own nutritional intake. In Jamaica, the planters hated it when a woman got pregnant and forced her to work right up to a few days before she delivered, and forced her back to the fields several days after she delivered, leaving the child to usually an old, lame person to look after, many of them dying very soon, much to the pleasure of the planters. This is reminiscent of the early concentration camps of Germany, such as Dachau, and the numerous ad hoc detention centers where malnourished inmates, Jewish inmates, were worked near to death before the final phase of direct killings. Now, using the data from the Atlantic Slave Trade database, the extent of the genocidal destruction of the Jamaican slaves can be demonstrated quantitatively by a comparison of the importation and demographic survival data of Jamaica and the US between the middle of the 17th century, when the British seized the island from the Spanish, and the third decade of the 19th century, when slavery was abolished in Jamaica. In this comparison, then, we're going to use the United States as a counterfactual to estimate the extent of the loss of human life in Jamaica. But first, let me show you quickly a visual of the slave trade and the importation of slaves to Jamaica and to the United States, to the West Indies and to the United States. This animation is not, by the way, a simulation. This is based on real data. Every dot you see is a slave ship. Okay, so can you just show very quickly? Okay, so this, can you set it going? Okay, where are we? Let's go. It's not moving? Just move it up to 1650 for me. You can, this. Try to get this. Right, go up to 1650. Right? Okay, and then keep going. You can press the little knob to stop it when I tell it to stop, okay? Okay. You see those lines? Every one of those dots is a ship, okay? We can actually stop it and see the amount of slaves who are actually in each ship, where they're going. But note, that's America up there. See the number of ships going to the Caribbean? How few are going to the entire US continent? Okay, we're up to about 1680. This continues. And note, still not many are going to South America. The South American slavery was to grow much later. But all of those are going to the Caribbean. Most of those are going to Jamaica and later to San Domingo. All right, we go up to, could you go up to about 1740? Just move it forward. Yeah, okay. That just gives a very strong visual image of, these are ships, every one of them is a ship. And could you stop it for me? And, okay, it's all right. Well, okay. And if we press on one of these, just one of these items, just bring it with the dot. Bring it there, yeah, bring it. Mm-hmm. You can actually get, as I said, it's not a simulation. This is the Venus, French one, 170-ton ship, left wider with 469 enslaved people, and arrived in Jamaica, port unspecified, with 400. Obviously, with 400, 69 had died. Now you can do that for every one of these dots. So this is real data. But the important point I want to emphasize is relatively few are going to the US compared with okay, thank you very much. So this is just a map which illustrates the pinpoint. All right. Now, let's go into a little detail. I won't bore you too much with this. But so I'm using then the US. I'm comparing the two, but it's not just a comparison. I'm going to be using the US as a counterfactual and to estimate the destruction, as I'll explain in a minute. So now this figure gives you, just in more static terms, the extraordinary this isn't working. But just look at the map. As you can see, blue represents Jamaica. Sorry, red is Jamaica, blue the US. And you can see this little island, by the way, which is smaller than Connecticut. You can see what's happening here, the amount going to Jamaica in red compared to all of North America, north and south. That's this is an incredible difference in the demand. Now, okay. Now look, I want you to look at figures. Figure 1 shows, which I just showed you, is the percentages involved. Now this figure, figure 2, shows the cumulative, okay, thank you, I have 1 minute left. I'll be through soon. The cumulative effect in absolute numbers. Between 1650 and 1830, a total of 1.07 million Africans were disembarked in Jamaica, while only 388,233 were taken to North America. In 1830, however, there were 2 million, over 2 million enslaved Africans in America, and including freebacks, some 2.3 million black souls. At that time, there were only 319,000 enslaved in Jamaica, and all told, 357,000, including people of some black ancestry. And what this astonishing difference amount to is this: had Africans and their descendants experienced the same rate of increase in Jamaica as had occurred in North America, a quite modest reproductive bar, the theoretically possible 1830 enslaved population in the island would have been 5,262,000 blacks, and its total population, including free people of color, would have been 6.09 million. Now, taking account of the 359,147 survivors in Jamaica in 1830, and using North American slavery as our counterfactual yardstick, we must conclude that there were 5.731 million missing black Jamaicans in 1830, which is a measure of the British protracted genocide in the island between 1655 and 1830. That is the genocidal figure, using this, I think, quite reasonable counterfactual. Okay, let me wrap up. Let me wrap up by noting that the unique experience of protracted genocide in Jamaica should not lead us to lose sight of what black Jamaicans share historically with their North American counterparts: the social death of slavery and the tragedy of prolonged ethnocide. And I want to close by returning to Dr. King's reflection on just this dimension of our shared past. Dr. King had an original contribution to our understanding of ethnocide. He noted that there were two aspects of this tragedy. One, which we discussed, was the decimation of our ancestral heritage. But of equal importance, Dr. King noted, and this is his original contribution, is that aspect of the ethnocide that is still with us. Namely, and here I quote him, the tendency to ignore the Negro's contribution to American life, which he adds is as old as the earliest history books and as contemporary as the morning newspapers, unquote. What Dr. King was getting at is the other side of slavery and its aftermath, the remarkable resilience and creative power of Black people in responding to their enslavement and post-emancipation oppression. The enslaved did not passively accept their social death. Everywhere they resisted, sometimes physically, more often socially, in the communities they fashioned as best they could, and culturally, in the remarkable way they constructed from the fragments of their decimated African past and from elements of the slaveholder culture that they could appropriate, patterns of life that were to have profound effects on the cultures of their oppressors. In Jamaica, in spite of its small size, the post-emancipation peasants and their urban descendants have created a vibrant culture whose Creole language, Rastafarian religion, reggae music, and athleticism have global impact. As you all know, the fastest men and women in the world are Jamaicans. And the greatest popular music, reggae, well, you know the story, right? In America, Black culture has had a profound impact on American civilization. In music, art, language, literature, rhetoric, cuisine, dance, humor, fashion, and sports, not to mention politics and the military. Indeed, whenever I listen to jazz, as I do obsessively, or watch the Super Bowl, I cannot help recalling the famous quip of the great Latin poet Horace on the influence of Greek slaves and their descendants on the culture of their Roman slaveholders. Captive Greece took captive her savage conqueror and brought the arts to rustic Latium, unquote. In so many ways, Black Americans have taken captive the culture of their once brutal conquerors. The denial of this remarkable achievement, King is saying, is the other side of cultural genocide, against which he urged Black Americans must rise up with an affirmation of their own vast contribution out of all proportion to what they have received in turn. Psychological freedom, he extolled, and I quote him, a firm sense of self-esteem is the most powerful weapon against a long night of physical slavery. No one has contributed more to the embrace of self-esteem and the vigor of psychological freedom among Black people everywhere than Dr. Martin Luther King through his life, his works, his rhetoric, and his sacrificial death. I thank you for your attention. All righty. Sorry to hold you up so long.
Oh, that's all right. It was worth it. Thank you very much for such a creative distillation of your work over the years. Given the time we've got, I've got 3 questions for you, because I want to give the audience a sense of the fullness of your being and your emergence in the period of decolonization as a sociologist and an intellectual. During your time in London, that city would become a contact zone for scholarship, literature and criticism against British and other modalities of empire. You were in contact with people like M.G. Smith, Eric Williams, Michael Manley, Walter Rodney, and C.L.R. James. How did your interactions and the networks you were in inform your development as an intellectual you
Oh,
are?
absolutely. Well, one of the persons you mentioned, M.G. Smith, was my teacher. He
Yes,
taught me
yes,
sociology.
yes.
In fact, he encouraged me to go into academia.
Interesting.
In fact, he didn't encourage me. He got me in his office one day and said, "You're going to become an academic."
This was at UWI, right?
But
Yeah, University of West Indies, at Mona campus.
And so I knew all of these people. They were critical. I met Eric Williams once. I'm currently writing a biography of C.L.R. James, who is
Oh, wow.
very closely related to Eric
yes.
Williams. And these people were important, very important, that generation, for my own development. Should also mention Manley,
Yes.
both the older Manley and the younger Manley,
Yes.
who encouraged me, in fact, to give up my job at the London School of Economics to return to Jamaica, where I was for many years his advisor. So yes, they were critical, absolutely critical.
Okay.
I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for them.
One for them. No, that was a rich cohort in that period of decolonization, anti-colonial nationalism, and the like. Second question, the topic of evil has been theorized and described in historical detail by writers such as Aimé Césaire, Hannah Arendt, Theodore Adorno, and most recently, Susan Neiman. As a social scientist, as opposed to a novelist, which you also are, a poet or a philosopher, did you have any conceptual challenges in measuring evil, in contrast, for example, to, say, Marx or James's idea of exploitation?
Well, you know, I move freely between disciplines,
Yes.
as you know, so I don't let sociology restrict me.
Right.
Yeah, it pays the bill, and that's good, but I've never felt the need to sort of confine my intellectual thinking. I'm as much a historian as and draw upon the history as much as, even more so, than sociology. And in that respect, one of my models was, of course, Du Bois,
Yes,
who
of
did
course.
just that, not to mention C.L.R. James.
Yes, yes.
So, and of course, sort of, that's why I moved easily from Jamaica to looking at the US and then looking at slaveries in other lands, and of course became involved with the history of freedom in Europe. And so that interdisciplinary approach always came naturally to me. And I've was recently honored by the Germans with the Hegel Prize,
Yes, yes.
in which they've recognized that the work was essentially related to Hegel and Hegel's own interpretation of Western culture and the significance of slavery in it.
Yes.
So, yeah, I've also not confined myself to the social sciences. I moved into fiction because in many ways, after writing The Sociology of Slavery, my first book on slavery, I felt that, in fact, there are many things I couldn't say as a sociologist or even as a historian, exploring the problem of evil, what it was like to be a slave, the field experience. And that could only be done through fiction, through the novel. That's why I wrote Die the Long Day, which is perhaps the first neo-slavery novel.
Yeah. So amongst that cohort of writers in that period, who were your literary influences? I mean, I'm wondering maybe George Lamming, Peter Abrams, Naipaul, Samuel Selvon. There's a range of people in that period.
Well, you know, I mean, James's early novel, Minty Alley, was important. And James had a very important influence on me. When I went to London, myself, Walter Rodney, and Norman Girvan got a letter out of the blue from the great man. How he knew, of course, the fact that he's an old commie may have explained it. I mean, you know, to find people. How he knew we were there. But he ordered us to come to his home every Friday evening, where we literally sat at his feet because he didn't have enough chairs, and gave us the true doctrine of Marxism, according to Trotsky. As you know, he was a friend of Trotsky. And so that was, but at the end of the semester of this friendly indoctrination, I'd finished writing The Children of Sisyphus, very much the same way that he brought over his first novel to London, Enthralling.
Yes.
And I very nervously gave him the manuscript and asked him what he thought about it. I didn't hear back from him for several weeks. In fact, I never heard back from him. About a month after I gave it to him, I got a letter from Hutchinson's, Britain's main publisher, saying they wanted to publish it. He read it, he liked it, and he sent it to his publisher. So that's how I got published as a novelist.
Interesting. Yeah, I think I remember a line from the Children of Sisyphus, which you mentioned the absence of ruins.
Now, An Absence of Ruins was the title of my second novel.
Okay.
But I should point out that, there's a strong about influences, apart from the West Indian writers. I was strongly influenced by Albert Camus. The very title, of course, came from the myth of Sisyphus. And if you go back to your question on evil, when I was after I left high school, before getting into university, I remember wandering around the library at Crossroads in Kingston and came across a philosophy section. And I pulled this work, largely because it was the smallest of the philosophy books, called The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus.
Yes.
And I read it. Of course, I didn't understand a word of it the first time I read it, but I was drawn to it, and I kept reading it over and over again right through my undergraduate years, and until I think I finally grasped it. And The Children of Sisyphus is influenced strongly by the title. In fact, come from The Myth of Sisyphus.
Interesting. Okay. All right, one last
Which
question.
explored, and Camus explored the problem of evil in a central way.
Yes.
And his works of Informer, The Rebel, of course, begins with the slave.
Yes.
Why does the slave eventually resist? And so on. So that problem, I said, explored and philosophically through that early existentialist phase, because after I matured from Camus, I went to Sartre. And the two didn't like each other very much, as you know. But for me, it was a natural development. So that's where I dug into the nature of evil to get back. Through Camus' problem of existence, why do we live in the face of meaninglessness?
Yes. One last question, but turning to, in many ways, was probably your best known work, Slavery and Social Death, because of the explication of social death, which you elaborated on here today. For better or for worse, the concept has taken on a life of its own, to the point that its application sometimes, not all the time, sometimes bears little resemblance to your original formulation. On the other hand, on one hand, Afro-pessimists, in my view, have reified the concept. On the other hand, some historians have critiqued the concept for its minimization of the agency of the enslaved during the era of racial slavery, especially the dynamic relationship between the enslaved and free persons in freedom. Toussaint Louverture and Saint-Domingue, for example. So in your view, how has the concept of social death held up over time?
I think the criticism missed sort of, I know who you're thinking of. I mean, it's just missed the point completely.
Right.
I never said there's no agency on the part of the slave. Right. And the concept of social death is not something I imposed upon the situation. I tried in my talk tonight, but I gave hundreds of examples in the book, that this is something came from reading the experience of slaves, accounts of slaves themselves, and that it was so widespread, the use of this metaphor, from examples of tribal societies. I mean, the Kalinago Caribs, for example, of the pre-Columbian Caribbean and Venezuela, who had a lot of slavery. One of the things they used to do is they cut their hair in a certain way when they died. When people died, cut their hair in a certain way as an act of mourning. Now, the slaves were required to cut their hair in the same way that people cut their hair when they were in mourning. They were mourning their death. Now, I didn't invent this. Let me say, this kept coming up over and over. And of course, in the Roman legal terms, the Roman being legalist, the notion of legal death is there. But everywhere one finds the idea, and as I quoted in my lecture today, the fact that slaves, when they had a voice, kept comparing their situation most eloquently, in the case of the authors I've cited today, as a condition of death. And Frederick Douglass referring to freedom as resurrection from death. So I didn't invent that idea. I didn't impose it on the literature. It was there, if you care to look at it in depth and comparatively. And this is true in China, in Korea, everywhere I turn. That metaphor keep going. Now, this does not mean that there was no agency. You can be, this is a condition imposed upon them, this is a condition they felt, they are horrified by it, and so on. But they could, in their interaction with each other, and wherever circumstances made it possible, they rebelled. Of course, there were massive slave revolts in the Caribbean, especially Jamaica, and the very last great slave revolt of 1832 resulted in, of course, the British government deciding after wavering to pass the Abolition Act. What's more, you've heard of the Haitian slave revolt. But long before the Haitian slave revolt, between 1650 and 1839, the Jamaican slaves waged an endless guerrilla war against the British, which resulted, and it is not true that the Haitian revolt was the first successful slave revolt. The wars between the Jamaican rebels and the British resulted in 1839 in them signing a treaty in which the British recognized their right to be free in their maroon communities. So I've written extensively on this, and so it's kind of ridiculous to claim that I don't recognize the agency of the slave. At the same time, the condition imposed upon them was a real one, which, as Frederick Douglass repeatedly pointed out, and Harriet and all these, Jacobs and all the others pointed out, was crushing, and it had consequences. Now, one of the important points I want to make, which I didn't have time to make here, is that what happened between 63 and 65 was the legal termination of slavery. Now, if you accept my fact that slavery was essentially a cultural phenomenon, form of social death, involving natal alienation, as I paid to, the fact that the blacks did not belong, that wasn't abolished overnight by legal stroke of the pen. That persisted. That's what Jim Crow was about. It was, I like to call it neo-slavery, a slavery that persisted in all but the legal aspect. And in that sense, slavery didn't really end until the civil rights laws of the 1965. So it's very important to recognize what were the circumstances under which the slaves lived. But that has nothing to do with whether they had agency or not. They rebelled culturally, they rebelled psychologically, they rebelled in all sorts. It's just absolute nonsense. People simply don't understand what they're reading when they read the work.
So how would you think that the concept like the second slavery, Robin Blackburn and folks like that, how do you think your work would be in conversation with theirs?
Well, I knew Robin quite well. In fact, I was on the editorial board of New Left Review in the 60s. Yes. So it's an interesting idea. I mean, I thought you were going to ask about Afro-pessimism, which you mentioned. And, let me just say what my own position. So Robin, I'm very sympathetic to his work. Yes. I mean, we talked a lot about this together. And, Sartre, in a work which was very important for me, What is Literature? But pointed out that when you write a work, it's only half finished. It's completed by the reader. And what the reader makes of it, you have no control over, okay? And they complete it in their own creative construction of what it means and so on. And that's how I see it, my Afro-pessimist friends, right? Obviously, social death does not exist in all senses, but I think there are elements of it in the content. There's slavery, and work is now being done on the intergenerational trauma of slavery. And here, let me just, if I might, just for a minute, say something. there's a lot of confusion on the part of many scholars, black and white, about how to interpret slavery, what to make of it, and of its consequences. Because a kind of pride, false pride, I think, sort of leads people to recognize that slavery was a ghastly institution, a great evil with enormous consequences. Now, we recognize the horror of slavery and its depredations and so on. But you know, in all oppressive situations, the subalterns suffer in two ways. They suffer from the crushing economic, social, and political oppression of the oppressors and the persistence in structural racism, as well as personal racism. But they are oppressed. Also, the subaltern also suffer in their immiseration, in the trauma they experience. Imagine for centuries the fact that any black woman could be raped with impunity. Do you think I'd leave people sort of unscathed? It's ridiculous. There are consequences, terrible consequences in relationships. I mentioned the element of trust in my talk as a fundamental feature of human existence. And trust is something which has been a huge problem in black American communities, part of the intergenerational trauma. And a major social scientist has been working on the problem of trust among black Americans. I refer to this as gender relations. Now, these are problematic. If for over 2 centuries, your woman could be raped at any time, you have no way of protecting women and children as a man. And, but that had sort of terrible consequences in terms of relationship between men and women. Now, one of the interesting differences between the West Indies and America is in interpreting the consequences of slavery, the intergenerational trauma, is the problem of the white gaze in America and how black Americans are influenced by that. So how black Americans see themselves is very often, and it's understandable, influenced by the white gaze. So one is very reluctant to say that there were these traumas and that these had consequences which must be overcome. Dr. King, by the way, had no problem with that. When he was talking about that section I wrote of him talking about the need to sort of, to unburden yourself of the past. That's what he is referring to emancipate yourself. Now, but if you say this too much, if you point to the intergenerational trauma, and work is just beginning finally to emerge among sociologists and historians to acknowledge this. Black Americans are beginning to accept the fact that you're not sort of saying, castigating them in any way. And as I said, it's due to the white gaze. Because where you don't have the white gaze, as in the black societies of the Caribbean, people talk about the intergenerational trauma. Almost every week, I read the Caribbean newspapers, especially the Gleaner, every day. Yes. A week doesn't go by in which the letters of the editor don't go on about the effects of slavery on us, how it fucked us up and so on, and the way we have to get over it and so on. And if anyone talked about this in this way, no one say, oh, you're being a Tom, you're not being proud, you're not extolling your virtues as a man and so on, which you get here. And so I have a very weird life. I go to Jamaica, I can talk in this way. I'm often seen as a radical there. I come here and I talk about intergenerational trauma, and people say, hey, what are you saying? So it's a funny kind of schizophrenic existence I live in the two cultures. But I think it's beginning to change. People are beginning to talk about the intergenerational trauma of slavery. So that's what I'm saying. There are two ways in which the oppressed are oppressed. The immisery, the external oppression, the structural racism, the personal racism, the inequalities, all the rest, they're there all through. But also the immiseration, the internal. I mean, there's no problem talking about this, even in Britain. I know this, one of the most famous sociological works in Britain is Learning to Labor. And this is done by a Marxist sociologist. And he's talking about how working class lads screw themselves up by their attitudes towards women, towards themselves, towards manhood, and so on. No one says to him, yeah, you're being, you're not saying the right thing, you're not being proud, and so on. So that's a problem which I think black scholars hear. And that accounts for the overemphasis in interpreting slavery on the slave community. Of course that was important, it was a slave community. But it went to an extreme where they were almost writing the slaveholder out of the story. And it was both. There was a slave community, there was agency, there was rebellion, but there was also the immiseration, the relationship, the way in which it's messed up relationships between men and women, between men and men, and so on, which we talk about freely in the Caribbean and in Latin America, but which you have to be careful, you have to look over your shoulder, and you have to preface any discussion of immiseration in talks like this one.
Well, Professor Patterson, you've given us enough to talk about for a lifetime. I appreciate your body of work. And our Center Director wants to give you a gift as a token of appreciation for your presence.
Thank you,
Good to
brother.
meet with you, man.
Thank you very much. In celebration of the sacrifice and legacy of Dr. King, it is my honor to present to you the 2025 Dr. King Award for just after.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Aha. Thank you.
One more, okay.